Alright, hello everyone. So we are here to go through chapter 2 part 1. So as we go through these videos, you will need to have the corresponding notes with you and annotate along with me as we go through the lesson. And please also watch this video fully such that you have learned every single part of the chapter. Okay, I hope you achieve understanding and not just aim to know basic facts. So as we go through these notes, I'll be annotating and explaining. So please listen carefully to the explanation such that when you return to lessons, you are fully able to apply your understanding to solve problems. Now, so in the previous chapter on experimental chemistry, we looked at various experimental techniques to do with filtration, distillation, how to separate mixtures, how do we collect gases and dry gases. So those are useful techniques to have in the lab. But now, let's turn our attention and focus on what is chemistry all about. And in this chapter, we are going to begin this study of chemistry. Now, chemistry is the science of matter. We are looking at chemical substances that are matter. So what is this idea of matter? Now, at the end of this chapter, you should be able to describe the three states of matter and the conversions between the three states of matter, as well as to give evidence for what is inside matter. Now, some of you may already have responded to the question that I posed in the chat group about what makes popcorn pop. And I seriously hope that you look through this carefully and think through the questions that I've posed in the group, because these are useful questions to get your brain thinking about scientific concepts. But let's start off by defining what we are studying in chemistry. So as mentioned, in chemistry, we're studying matter. So what is matter? So for instance, steel, water, ice, oil, air, these are all examples of matter. Because whether it's steel, water, or air, it has mass and occupies space. So matter is anything that has mass and occupies space. Now this is crucial because it tells us that, hey, these are the things that we are interested in studying in chemistry. Now, what is vacuum? Now, vacuum is a region where air is sucked out. All the air is sucked out. And because of that, a vacuum is not matter. Similarly, light and sound. Now, light and sound are forms of waves, and waves transfer energy. Energy does not have mass, and therefore they are also not matter. So really, this allows us to focus our understanding of what we are studying in chemistry. In chemistry, we are studying matter, which happens to be all the chemical substances which are made up of particles. Okay? So for the next 3 chapters, we are going to be answering this important question. What is inside matter? If I were to look at matter under a very powerful microscope, what will I see inside it? And this is the starting point of chemistry. We are looking at the particles inside matter. So as you learn in Set 1, matter contains and is made up of particles. And the arrangement and movement of the particles is different depending on the state of matter, whether it's solid, liquid, or gas. So over here, we need to know the names of the processes that convert from one state to another. So firstly, we have solid to liquid. Solid to liquid is called melting. The reverse of melting, which is converting from liquid to solid, is freezing. Then we have liquid to gas. From liquid to gas is boiling and evaporation. Boiling and evaporation are different processes. We will go through the differences between boiling and evaporation in class. But even though they involve going from liquid to gas, boiling is not the same as evaporation. The reverse, from gas to liquid, that conversion is called condensation. You have learned this in chapter 1 when we went through distillation. In distillation, the setup will have a condenser. So the condenser helps to cool and condense your vapors to form the pure liquid distillate. Okay, so condensation is converting from a gas to a liquid. Now, for some substances that you have learned, they are able to go directly from solid to gas without going through the liquid state. Going directly from solid to gas is called sublimation. So you have learned substances like iodine, dry ice, which is solid carbon dioxide. They are able to undergo sublimation. The opposite of sublimation is called vapor deposition. Okay, so for instance, carbon dioxide gas, when you cool it down, it undergoes vapor deposition to form dry ice, which is solid carbon dioxide. Now, these names of the processes, you may have seen them at lower sec. Now, at lower sec, when you studied the particulate model of matter, you also learned how to describe the arrangement and movement of particles in each state. In particular, for a gas, the particles in a gas, they move in all directions at high speeds. On the other hand, particles in a solid, they vibrate about fixed positions. Now, this movement is obviously very different because in a gas, the particles can move in all directions at high speeds. We can come to the conclusion that gases must have the highest energy among solids, liquids, and gases. On the other hand, because in a solid, the particles are only able to vibrate about fixed positions, this tells you that the particles have the lowest energy in the solid state. Now, once we have established this order of energy, solid having the lowest energy, gases having the highest energy, we can come to the conclusion that as we go from a solid to liquid, liquid to gas, or a solid to a gas, the energy content of the substance increases. This means that the substance takes in energy from the surroundings. Okay? They have to take in energy from the surroundings such that the energy level of the substance has increased. Now, there's a name for this. Processes that take in energy are described as endothermic. So if you think of the word entrance, enter. So in this case, energy is entering, going in from the surroundings to our chemical substance. Such reactions and processes which take in energy from the surroundings are described as endothermic. So conversely, freezing, vapor deposition, condensation, they involve the energy level of the substance decreasing. Therefore, energy is given out or released to the surroundings. Such processes are called exothermic processes because they involve energy going out, being released outwards to the surroundings. So not only should you learn the names of the processes, you need to also learn how to relate the energy of each state to the movement of particles, as well as state which processes involve taking in energy from the surroundings and which processes involve giving out energy to the surroundings. So this is basically a recap of what you have learned in Sec 1 under particulate model of matter. But what is the evidence for such a particulate model of matter? What led scientists to believe that matter was made up of particles? Now, this was the work of many scientists, but let's focus on one scientist first, who is English botanist Robert Brown. So being a botanist, he was studying flowers, in particular pollen grains. So he dropped some pollen grains into water, and he noticed as he looked at the pollen grains under the microscope, the pollen grains seemed to move, and they moved in a constant random motion. Now, this is called Brownian motion, named after Robert Brown himself. So, Robert Brown was curious and asked himself why. Why will the pollen grains move on their own in this constant random manner? And of course, the idea is the pollen grains were able to move because they were colliding constantly with the particles in the water as well as the air above the water. And during these collisions, energy was transferred from the water particles to the pollen grains. And that's why the pollen grains had the energy to continuously move in a random manner. Importantly, the water particles and air particles themselves were also in constant random motion. As a result, that's what Robert Brown observed. The pollen grains themselves also moved in a constant random motion. And this Brownian motion was pivotal in allowing us to come up with what we call today as the kinetic particle theory, or the particulate model of matter. So the kinetic particle theory states that all matter is made up of small, discrete particles. Now the particles are very small, you can't see them with your naked eye. You will need to use a very powerful microscope to see them. But what is the meaning of discrete? Now discrete means the particles have a defined boundary. We are used to drawing particles as circles, but this of course is a representation. Not all particles in matter will actually be a circular shape. We are just using circles to visualize and represent them in a simpler manner. But the idea here is the boundary of each particle is defined. Okay? So the particles are not just fuzzy, they have defined boundaries, and that's why we call them discrete particles. Now, importantly, these particles are not stationary. They are in constant random motion. Okay? Now, besides that, depending on the state of matter, solid, liquid, or gas, the arrangement and movement of particles will be different. And finally, if it's a pure substance, the particles inside it will be identical. So take, for example, if we have pure oxygen will be made up of identical particles, which are oxygen. Okay? So these are the four main tenets of the kinetic particle theory. So we have gone through Brownian motion and how that is evidence of the kinetic particle theory. Now, there are other pieces of evidence from other scientists that we will go on to now, which help to support the kinetic particle theory. Another very important piece of evidence is the phenomenon of diffusion. So we have learned this as well in lower sec, where we notice that if we spray perfume at one corner of the classroom, very soon the opposite corner of the classroom can smell the perfume. This is because the perfume contains particles, and the particles can diffuse from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Now, so diffusion is the net movement of molecules in a substance from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration, and this is what we call down a concentration gradient. Diffusion we will cover in part 2 of the notes, okay, but suffice to say that diffusion is strong evidence that matter is made up of small discrete particles in constant random motion. We have also been through Brownian motion, what Robert Brown saw under the microscope with the pollen grains. That's also evidence for the kinetic particle theory. Other pieces of evidence: when you mix water 100 cm cube with ethanol 100 cm cube, you may expect the final volume that you observe to be 200 cm cube. However, what you would observe is somehow when you mix the two together, the resultant volume is less than 200 cm cube. Now, why is that the case? That's the case because there are spaces between the particles. There are spaces between the ethanol molecules. There are spaces between the water molecules. And because there are spaces between them, they can start fitting into the spaces between them. As they fit into the spaces, the final resultant mixture will have a volume that is less than 200 cm cube. And finally, how do we know that the arrangement and movement of particles differs depending on which state the substance is in? We know this because solids, liquids, and gases have different physical properties. In primary 4, you may have learnt solids have a fixed shape. But liquids do not have a fixed shape. They can flow freely. They take the shape of their containers. This has to do with the particles having a different arrangement and movement of particles in a liquid. Besides that, we know that in order to melt something or boil something, or in this case evaporate and sublime something, we need heat energy to be taken in. For instance, to boil water, you will need to connect the kettle to electricity or put the kettle on top of a stove, because energy is required for boiling to take place, because energy is taken in from the surroundings to change from one state to another, from solid to liquid, liquid to gas. This tells you that gases have higher energy than solids. Therefore, it tells you the movement of particles in a gas must be different. So these are the experimental evidences for the kinetic particle theory. Now, let's end off this lesson by going through what is the arrangement and movement of particles like in each state of matter. Now, importantly, you will need to be able to describe the arrangement and movement of particles according to the state of matter, as well as to draw a diagram showing the arrangement of particles. So firstly, let's go to the arrangement of particles. Now, in terms of arrangement in a solid, the particles in a solid are very closely packed in fixed positions in a regular manner. So firstly, how do I represent that it's closely packed? I represent the closely packed by ensuring the particles are touching each other. Now the key word here is touching each other. When drawing, you have to ensure the particles touch each other if it's closely packed. But it should not overlap with each other. So the particles, when you are drawing them, please take care to ensure they are not overlapping each other. Next, how do we know and show that it's regular? We show that it's regular because it's in neat, straight rows. So if the arrangement is known to be a regular arrangement, such as particles in a solid, you will need to draw the particles in neat, straight rows. Now, on the other hand, for the arrangement of particles in a liquid, they are closely packed, meaning they should still touch. Remember, they are touching but not overlapping. In a liquid, the particles are closely packed in an irregular or random arrangement. You can see now we no longer have neat straight rows. It's a zigzag arrangement of the particles. That tells you it's irregular. And finally, in a gas, the particles are spaced very far apart from one another in an irregular arrangement. Okay? Now let's move on to the movement. So in a solid, the particles cannot move freely. What that means is that the particles cannot move out of their positions, but they can vibrate about their fixed positions. So their particles are still moving in a solid, just that it's a vibration about fixed positions. In a liquid, the particles are now able to move freely and they slide past one another easily. So the motion is sliding past one another. Finally, in a gas, the particles in the gas move freely in all directions at high speeds. So it's important to mention both the direction and the high speed. Okay, very often students forget all about the direction. They only mention particles move at high speeds. That's not acceptable. In a gas, the particles move freely in all directions at high speeds. So you need to be able to draw the diagram to show the arrangement. You also need to be able to describe in words the arrangement and movement of particles in each state. Now, we shall now move on to the forces of attraction between the particles. There must be some forces of attraction that attracts the particles to each other. Given that in a solid the particles are closely packed, it must tell you that the forces of attraction between the particles in a solid must be very strong. Conversely, in a gas, because the particles are spaced very far apart, the forces of attraction between the particles must be very weak in a gas. So learn how to relate the packing with the forces of attraction. And finally, we move on to the energy present in each state of matter. And this is where we relate the movement with the energy content. Because in a solid, the particles only vibrate about fixed positions, this tells you the energy level of a solid is low. So particles in a solid have very little energy when compared with a gas, which contains particles moving in all directions at high speeds. This tells you that particles in a gas should have very high energy in comparison to particles in a solid. And so, this particular page where you have the drawing of the diagrams as well as a description of the arrangement and movement of particles in each state will be crucial to learn. You will need to learn this very well, but don't just memorize it. Learn how to deduce the energy, the forces of attraction between particles from the arrangement and movement of particles. See the linkages which I've drawn for you on this page as you learn this page. And now you should be ready to complete all questions in checkpoint 1. Please complete checkpoint 1 to check your own understanding before coming back for our next face-to-face lesson. And now you are ready to complete checkpoint 1 as well as move on to lecture video part 2. In lecture video part 2, we will continue with this set of notes to go through the properties of substances in different states of matter as well as go through the heating and cooling curve. Alright, thank you so much and see you in part 2 of this lecture video.